Addiction touches so many lives all around the world. And what if you have a family member or a friend suffering from addiction? What do you do? Well, today's guest is Lisa Gennosa, and she stopped by the Intentional Clinician to tell us about her story and her book, which is entitled Incurable Hope, a memoir and survival guide for coping with a loved one's addiction. This book is a loving mother's memoir of her only child's disease of addiction and overcoming the multiple traumas he endured. This book examines how substance use disorder, mental health, and trauma can collide with the legal and medical systems. More importantly, it is a survival guide, a resource guide, and a desperately needed tour guide through the labyrinth of addiction. Lisa Gennosa lives with her husband, Dr. Thomas Gennosa, in a small rural town in eastern North Carolina, where she is a practicing physician assistant. She is a dedicated wife and mother who grew up as the third child of a liquor and narcotics agent. Her breadth of exposure to healthcare, the legal field, and parenting an addict provided the foundation to reveal the things we least like to talk about, but most need to. She has done countless speaking engagements for the police, parole and correctional officers, paramedics, nurses, and other hospital staff, as well as medical students, in an effort to create positive change and provide them with the much-needed education on substance use disorder, mental health, and crisis intervention. Lisa has dedicated her time to work with incarcerated men and women in an unprecedented heroin recovery program in North Carolina. Her most valuable contribution for the book came from her son and his expansive understanding of emotional intelligence and the human condition. His battle with addiction, trauma, and mental health forced her to delve into the world she didn't want to accept. Yet it gave her the profound opportunity to learn and to listen and to understand so that she may share the information with the hopes that someone else not just survives, but thrives despite the pain they endure. And right before we get to the interview, if you are a therapist looking for medical billing services that are ethical and excellent and efficient, check out www.therapistbillingservicesllc.com. That's Therapist Billing Services. Billing services made by therapists for therapists. Okay, let's dive in. Welcome to the podcast, Lisa Gennosa. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Excellent. So I'm excited to dive in to talk about your experience and your book, Incurable Hope, a memoir and survival guide for coping with a loved one's addiction. And I think that this book is well needed because a lot of people who go through having a family member have addiction have all this shame about it. They feel awful. They feel responsible. They feel like they are powerless. They just have to go to like Al-Anon groups and be sad the rest of their life. But I know that by confessing, really writing all of your thoughts and feelings, maybe not all of them, but this book is quite a confessional memoir and has information about mental health and drugs and alcohol and addiction in the systems that you're showing kind of like a bigger story about somebody going through that, not only with their loved one, but themselves, as well as the family members who take a lot of the emotional brunt of this as well. So,
absolutely. I think what right from the top, it's this applies to way more individuals than we could possibly imagine. As a practitioner, as a physician assistant, I see so many patients, and once they know my story, so many people reveal, their own trials and experiences with their family members or people they care about, or their marital partner, or someone even that they work with. So this applies again to so many folks. I always use the analogy with the bowling ball. The individual with the addiction is the bowling ball, and at the end of the line there are all the pins, and about 12 people per one individual with addiction are affected on average. And in the United States, it's about half the country. The statistics are about half the country are affected by someone they care about, love, know, with addiction. The actual exact percentage is 47%. So that is a large number of individuals that are dealing with this.
Yes, I actually did not know that statistic, and that is good to know. I think that a lot of people who are going through it, I mean, from my anecdotal evidence of being a therapist, don't know other people that are going through it, right? And so finding support, if you're a family member with an addicted loved one, finding support is incredibly important. And there's actually a lot of support groups that have been starting up and have been going. Of course, Al Anon is for families, but I actually really like this group called Parents of Addicted Loved Ones. And it's going all over the US. And I actually know the founder of that
Wow.
personally. And he has really devoted his life to that. And it's pal.org. And if you're a person out there looking for support, it's very important because you're not powerless. Now, you can't stop the person from having an addiction, but you certainly have options. And that's some of the stuff I want to talk about today, as well as your own story about the struggles with your son and his difficulties with addiction, going back to when he was a teenager, actually.
Absolutely.
And from what I've read, statistically, I don't have it in front of me, but a lot of people who have major addiction problems in their 20s and later actually started when they were in their teens. And that's what I've read before.
Yeah, the statistics are really bad for individuals that start really prior to the age of they break it down, but if you start before the age of 16, before the age of 14, things like that, your chances are substantially and incrementally higher as you get older for the risk of addiction. He started around the age of 12 or 13 drinking. We didn't know about it, but he was drinking at that point. And so really that's when the brain is trying to develop, and things are supposed to be happening that are not able to happen. The synapses and things aren't able to connect like they should as a young person. So unfortunately, you're not getting the proper brain development when you start at an early age. So you're really setting up for potential, disaster later, which unfortunately for his case, it did.
Yes, that totally makes sense. As because the brain has a process that follows the DNA and the coding. 0 to 5, we know, is very important for children to have like a nurturing parent or parents, hopefully, around. And then from 5 all the way, now they're saying that the brain is still growing through the age of 25 for most people. So that
Right.
attachment to not only parents but positive friends and social groups and things like that is just so important for brain development. But alcohol and drugs disrupt that in different ways depending on the person's genetics, depending on the person's level of drinking or drug use, and that is causing all sorts of problems. And it's always different per person what it affects, but definitely propensity to have a very bad addiction in adulthood is there, and as well as usually social issues and sometimes organizational troubles and emotional troubles as well. So he started young, and then I think for a lot of people, I mean, you're a physician assistant, your husband is a doctor, from what I've gathered, and there's a lot of, it's like, how could this happen to us? Like, we've got, resources, we're smart people trying to do all the right things. Can you kind of talk to a little bit about that? Because I feel like a lot of people are still in that stage. Like, like, I don't even want to know this is true. I don't want to think about it.
Yeah. And that's why partly why I put this out there was because, I think the assumption is you guys should be able to figure this out. If you can't figure out, how am I going to? But the truth of the matter is, we were just as blind as anybody else. And I wanted to share that because I don't want anybody else to carry that guilt and shame for not being able to recognize things ahead of time, right? It is a very insidious condition, especially very young. And there are a lot of overlap. There's a lot of overlap in terms of, hormonal changes and peer development and all those things when you're a young teenager. My son had some major sleep challenges, some mood instability, some anger issues, some peer, I don't know if I said peer challenges, but all those things are associated with being, growing up and experiencing life to some degree. But I think looking back now, I think we downplayed some of that, and we didn't recognize or think about what else could be going on, and we should have. And I will say that I think parents are a little better educated with mental health and substance abuse today, more so than when my son was young and when he was little. So I think it's a little bit better. But the more we talk about this, the more we have these conversations, that's where I feel like parents will get the tools and the skills to sort of recognize these little changes that they might not otherwise tune into. So that's why I'm hoping that this does that.
Yes, I agree with you. I think it's getting a little bit better, but only because people have been coming out of the darkness and sharing their story and writing books and going on podcasts and writing blogs and social media in the positive way that social media can affect sharing those stories.
Yep.
And I've seen the development since I was a clinician starting in 2007. It was still a large stigma around talking about any of this stuff. And not only has that changed in the last 16 years, but in most, not everywhere, but like it's more accessible. The information is accessible. And there's a bunch of books written by doctors and psychiatrists and therapists and people that have recovered themselves from addiction that are really putting it out there, like your book. And I think this is hopefully helping. If people don't know where to turn, the information's there. The support groups are there.
Yes.
If you can't get to a support group, you can literally take a phone and dial the Zoom number to actually be on an audio call with the support group. I mean, there are, at this point, unless you have zero resources and are, destitute, you can get help as a family member for someone who's going through an addiction. I think the hard part is wishful thinking and denial, because a lot of us don't want to admit that somebody might have an addiction. And like you said with your son, a lot of kids get bullied and have sleeping problems. Like, how do we know that it's going to turn into a mental health condition, right? Especially, part of that is growing up, but then part of it, when you said we should have, it's like, well, right. But at the same time, how could you have known that would have turned into something? And for some kids, it doesn't. And for some kids, it does. And so, as parents, it's a difficult process because you want the best for your kid, but you also don't want to like helicopter over every single thing they do and, watch them too much. It's a delicate balance.
It absolutely is. Oh my gosh. And, when my son was going through the bullying phase, he tried to reassure us that, he was okay through that. Today, it would probably be wise to, get some outside assessment of what's going on. And we didn't at the time. And I think that's the difference today, is that people are more in tune with, okay, maybe this needs, just a little bit more, research here on everything being okay, truly. Because his was pretty, if you read, in the book, it pretty traumatic. I mean, telling him kill himself and things like that. So, we know what some of the outcomes are with individuals that are getting these messages, unfortunately, in this country. When he was getting those messages, he was like, I'm okay. But he wasn't. He was self-medicating and, coping in a very different way in private and in secret. And we didn't know that.
Right. So not talking about denial yet, actually talking about the fact of why do people start having a road to addiction. We talked about starting young. Some people do it to party, do it to fit in, and all of a sudden it feels so good that they continue doing it. And some people, it's always a variety of reasons, but that people do. It's not just one, but the coping with the nervous system dysregulation. And when you're getting bullied, not only do words hurt, we figure that out. Sometimes they hurt worse than getting punched because they stick with you and they come back over and over and over in your mind. And as a young person, you're developing your self-esteem, your sense of identity. Who am I in the world? And when people are telling you you're worthless, kill yourself, and all of this, especially with online bullying, which is happening even more through text messages and different apps, that is affecting your child's brain. And I think it's I don't even know if we have if our system is fully adjusted to understand how detrimental that is. For instance, the Average Child Experiences Study, which I've cited before in this podcast, in the 90s talks about all these different ACE scores, which is still very relevant today. And those are correlated with negative health outcomes, mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes, and addiction. However, I've said this before recently to a friend, which was I feel like the ACE is missing about 10 to 15 more questions, right? And
Yeah.
some nuance like, were you bullied and how often were you bullied? Did you feel left out? Did you feel ostracized in your social group? Back in the Middle Ages, besides the torturing and death that they did, one of the worst punishments they would do to people actually was banishment. You're out of our tribe. Go away. We'll never see you again. And they knew because of, I don't know, experience that would kill someone normally, right? And so if you don't belong to a group and you're getting told that you're horrible from the group, this is doing mental damage that can cause depression, anxiety, even PTSD, depending on the situation.
Absolutely. And I come back to that because we were also moving. We had moved, I think, 2 times in that span of time. And while others do that, for some that are, a little more fragile, he definitely had some fragile tendencies going into those moves. When you're moving and you're trying to fit into another peer group and you're ostracized from that peer group, and then you're told things, you're bullied on top of that. So again, I come back to the fact that what we didn't do at the time was dig a little deeper. Because we didn't want a helicopter. He said, I'm fine. I got this. I'm okay. And we believed him because we didn't want to be that overbearing, force with him. He was a young man. And as a young man too, there was that other layer as a man, developing into a man. There's that other layer of, masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
We tried to respect that, but by respecting that, we totally missed an opportunity to dive in early on. And so if I keep coming back to it, but if parents can be a little more investigative, if things like that are happening than we were, to say, even though your child may be saying, I'm fine, I'm good, everything's okay, still do a little bit of that work. And again, I think we're more open to doing that now.
Yes, I think that's a very good takeaway already for people is there's no harm in investigating further.
Yeah.
And even preventatively getting your kid into therapy, even maybe 10 or 12 sessions, just to see if they say something to the therapist, because maybe they won't tell you because he wanted to act like tough for his mom and dad. I'm tough. I've got this, high achiever type mentality. You describe his personality as very dynamic, very likable, very charismatic. And I think maybe, that was part of his coping skill was to tell himself he was okay. Right.
Yes.
And as a man, in our culture, masculinity is sometimes equated with shutting down your emotions and acting tough. That's a message we get from movies and rap music and country music and different things like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that message gets with teens. And I think, again, schools are doing a better job of that in certain areas, teaching emotional wellness and things like that. And that men and women both have emotions. They just express them differently depending on their socialization, et cetera. But I think that's a key point for parents is there's no harm in digging deeper. And I always say, like, until you're 18, like you definitely want a parent to check you. Am I being a helicopter parent? Yes. But also, like, do I need to investigate my kid more? Probably, because kids don't tell the truth all the time because they are still figuring out their life and what the truth is, right? So part of him probably felt I am fine, right? But part of him was not fine, and he maybe didn't know how to express that and show you.
Absolutely. That's exactly what happened. And, we have dealt quite a bit with that guilt associated with this. Why weren't we more in tune? Why didn't we do the work at the time? But we did at the time what we knew to do at that time. We weren't talking, he's going to be 30 years old this year. We weren't talking about the the amount of counseling and things like cognitive behavioral therapy or anything. Like, we weren't discussing these things years and years ago when he was a young teenager, nearly almost 20 years ago. And so I think this is just something that is an opportunity for improved outcomes all the way around.
Very good. Yes, I agree with that. That early intervention is key, and we know that from every type of disease. So, of course, addiction and mental health are forms of disease, and they need to be intervened as soon as possible. And prevention is important. Um, it's so important. I mean, because oftentimes kids don't have the language to tell parents normally. Now, I think because kids are getting exposed to this stuff more often through
Mhm.
the positive TV shows and the positive media that's out there. There is some of that, a lot of negative, but some positive. That
Correct.
it's becoming more mainstream. I've seen I don't watch too much television, but I've heard of characters in television shows going, "I'm going to therapy," and like that's new. That's very new. That's like the last 6 years. I've noticed that,
Yes, me too.
which is so cool. I'm so glad that that's making it into the culture, into the mainstream culture. Um, it's just like, oh, it's a regular thing. I'm going to work out. I'm going to therapy. I'm going to physical therapy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there are still a large portions of the country and cultures that think that that's for weak people. Like we don't need to do that, and that's only if you're really bad, right? But actually, it can be preventative too. That's why we go for checkups to the doctor to make sure that we're healthy. We might not know.
Mhm.
Um, so, so that being said, there is. I'm going to quote your book, but since this seems to be rolling off, I'm just going to go to some more topics I have questions about, which is, let's just say now, okay, then you noticed something was wrong, but there was a part of you in the book you talk about that didn't want to see how bad things were. Can you talk a little bit about that for people?
Oh yeah. I mean, there was years of denial, and this is just um, teenage antics, and he's gonna, he's gonna grow out of this. This is gonna get better. It really wasn't until many years later when we're talking about, legal issues and medical issues, and those didn't start happening right away, obviously. So you can't deny, DUIs and hospitalization for, gastric bleeds and pancreatitis and incarceration. You can't deny those things. However, before those things started happening, there is a lot of denial, and that's why we ended up getting to those other phases. Just because I just didn't want to accept it. I was too, you just have these expectations of life, and they are very simple, really. We had a very simple life. And I just could not see my life or his life or our family's life in any other light than it to just be, sort of status quo, sort of societal status quo. You grow up, you go to school, you go to college, you get a job, you get a family, you have kids, so on and so forth. I had never allowed myself to imagine that it would be another way. But I will say, when that day came, there was a day, and there were multiple days really, but there was that time when I got to acceptance, the acceptance of, not that he's an alcoholic or a drug addict, but the acceptance that this is what our family is dealing with now. This is what our family looks like. This is what we are facing. This is how it is going forward. It was at that moment that everything changed. And they, that's a little bit cliche, because they say you can't take care of treat your, addiction until you accept that you're addicted. So I was the same thing. It was the same way for the family. And I do talk to my patients about that as well, because a lot of them can't accept it. They don't want to believe that their family member is that bad off, or, and I try to, coach them and guide them and give them the book and some advice along the way, and, encourage that acceptance earlier on. Because I think that the challenge was that I spent so much time in denial that I didn't take care of what was in front of me for too long. And I perpetuated the negative outcomes that we have dealt with. And along with, as I talk about in the book, there was a lot of law enforcement and medical failures along the way that also help perpetuate this, his mental health, his addiction issues, and then of course the traumas. So it is just so important to get to that point of acceptance earlier in your ordeal, to kind of be able to, take care of it head on, because if otherwise you're gonna avoid, and it's going to keep going and going and going and getting worse and worse and worse. And we know what happens then.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for saying that. I definitely am going to touch on the criminal justice system in the hospitals later on with that. But with what you're talking about with denial, it's like so hard to accept that this is how bad things are. It's like, it's like shock. How could this possibly be us? Right? I wanted a family that's like a sitcom. We have some problems, but by the end of the show, we all make up and hug and go to bed. I did not want a soap opera. That's not what I signed up for here. I've actually worked my whole life not to have a soap opera ongoing. And here we are, and risk of death. I mean, that's scary for anybody to have a family member, let alone your own child, And so what I want to say to parents is, you can get help too. And as a family member, not only do you need a support group, you may need a therapist, because it is it's at least an adverse experience, if not a traumatizing experience, to have your child get close to death, and you have no control, because when things got really bad, he was over 18. From what I remember, is like when things got really bad, he was a bit older.
Yes, yeah, and you have no control.
You don't. You can only try to love them or whatever, but you can also do things that hurt, which are, we feel our gut instinct tells us, help, gotta help, gotta pay for things, gotta get them fixed up, and then this time they'll be okay, right? And I know you talk about that in the book a little bit, but I call those, like, we get fixated in our helping pattern, because if this is my theory, if I was in that situation, maybe that's what would help me, getting me a new car, getting me fixed up, getting me all cleaned up, start me over, new town. Let's do it, But actually, it's not addressing the main problem, because if I'm in denial and I'm thinking they'll just get better naturally, kind of like I would, that's not true. When you have an addiction, it is wired in the brain and the body. Yes. And it is wired, as hard as you want to have willpower and white knuckle it, as they call it, grab the seat, don't grab the bottle, don't, smoke the weed. It is become part of the body, and it's almost impossible to explain unless you've been through it, or maybe as a person that maybe in a mild version, you've been addicted to like potato chips or something like that, and had to like get it out of your house, because if you eat one, you can't stop. Right. But that's a very mild version of something that completely alters your entire consciousness. Right. And it alters your entire personality, and it can cause your mental health to get so much worse, so that you actually are more likely to commit suicide. I don't know the statistics on this, but I read somewhere that almost every suicide in the US is not done sober. It's upwards of 70%, something like that. Is that the person might have just had a few beers, but they are doing it on something, because to get that kind of courage up. So can you talk a little bit about unhelpful helping patterns that as a family we might, or you, or what you see with your patients, kind of fall into, that actually perpetuates the addiction?
Yeah, the unhelpful things that we did, my gosh, I mean, we paid for the very first thing that we did that I think was wrong was he was young and he had his first DUI, and we stepped in and said, oh, we got to get a lawyer. We got to help you with this. Lawyers are going to be thousands of dollars, and you can't afford that. So we'll take care of that. We're going to get that, because if you're in a state of denial too, you recognize that a DUI or anything on your license is going to affect you the rest of your life, pretty much. And so we were like, well, if we get a lawyer and get this, managed a little bit better, and that it'll just kind of go away, and you won't have to deal with this. But that, in effect, means that you're not dealing with it, and they're not dealing with it, and it isn't yours to really deal with. Exactly. he's old enough to drive, so he had sort of the ability to figure that out. So the very first thing was, we shouldn't have stepped in with paying for a lawyer. He should have been the one to figure out, how am I going to manage this situation? And then from there, I mean, it got so bad, there wasn't anything we weren't paying for. I mean, we were, and it was, I was just being mama bear. I've got to keep my kid alive. He's going to be homeless. He's going to be hungry. And you can't tell a parent that their child is hungry or homeless, because that instinctual thing is going to take over, and you're going to find any way under the sun to help that situation so that doesn't happen. But in effect, right, you're giving them everything so that they can keep doing what they're doing. And sometimes they have to, as hard as this is to imagine or to say, sometimes they have to be homeless for a couple days or a couple weeks. And that's unimaginable. It still is to me, but it's happened. My son has been homeless for a short, periods of time. And it wasn't until after I was able to accept what was going on that I could let that happen. I could actually let that happen, because when that happened, he would get to that place of his own, reckoning. Okay, I got to take care of this. So it's really just, we flew across the country many, many times. We gave him, helped repair vehicles. We got the vehicles out of towing. We, paid for his groceries, his rent, his doctor bills, therapists, IOP. He did go to rehab 9 times. And during those times, there were some that, didn't take insurance. So we would pay out of pocket large amounts for him to do those rehab, stays. So we did it all. We kind of just threw everything at the wall to see what would stick. And unfortunately, it just wasn't working until we said, hey, wait a minute, what are we doing? What are we doing here?
Right. We have to try to help them face their own addiction. And it's a dangerous game, because it's not a game. Because you're right. Like, when do you help versus when do you not help? One time you don't help, they could die. I mean, that's the reality, is they could die. So for parents, I have a little video course I made on Udemy called For Parents of Young Adults. And it's like only like $12 or something. I don't know. It's like a 3-hour video course I made for parents who are trying to face these decisions, alcohol or not, and what I say in there is, one of the things is trying to let natural consequences happen at a low dose, so that the stakes don't become higher and higher and higher in their life. So for instance, that's one of the hardest things to tell parents. I actually worked with some parents, and their kid got arrested for being high and driving into somebody. And this was the second time. And I said, you can do what you want, and I can't give you advice 'cause I'm a therapist. But let me ask you, what happens if you pay for this next lawyer? What happened the first time? Well, he didn't learn. Okay. So what happens? So they didn't pay for a lawyer, and he got court appointed, and he got 6 months, something like that. And he came out a new person. And now he still has his struggles. It's not that easy, right? But he started taking accountability, because he was so surprised that the parents didn't bail. And he said, I can't do it this time. You've got to learn. And that took everything in them to do that. They were depressed, guilty, stressed out, very upset, and I was like, listen, like, it's your choice. You want to bail him out any day, you can get a good lawyer and he will get out for sure, because it was such a minor incident. He had, I can't go into it too much, but we want natural consequences. And the hard part is, when you're with drugs and alcohol, the consequences could be deadly. And so how do you step in? And I think there's books on this, and you talk about this in your book, but emotional support and treatment are the two things I think parents should give as much as they can. As much as you can pay for treatment, as much as you can give emotional support, the better. Sometimes the treatment may have to be like the shelter that gives free drug and alcohol treatment or something like that. But help them with that. The hard part is when we start paying for things, if they have a real addiction, if they have a very strong addiction, and this isn't just a short-term problem because of a relationship or something they're going through, anything we give them can be used to perpetuate the addiction.
Yeah.
And I've seen parents give their kids like, well, I just gave them a McDonald's gift card and they sold it for meth. Like
Mhm.
they sold it for $25 for meth. Like,
Mhm.
and I don't want them to be hungry. I know, neither do I. But if they are hungry, eventually hopefully their survival instincts will kick in.
It's
Hopefully.
it's that word, hopefully, yeah. But and it was also when I said, and this sounds weird, I've said this to other folks before, but it was when I realized that I could lose my son. When I accepted that my son could die. And it's even hard to, say that out loud, but when you get to that understanding, you can free yourself, you let go when you know that you are nobody special, meaning that you can lose your child just like anybody else can. And so many people do. And we get in, and there is that real probability, or not probability, excuse me. There's that real possibility, and you have to accept that. And then that gives you a little bit of, I've done a lot of reading to kind of get to that point, to that understanding. um I think one of the best books I read about that really, really helped me through that was, I'm gonna forget the name now. Solve for Happy.
Mm.
Solve for Happy made me realize that losing my son was a possibility, and that it was a point of acceptance that enabled me to help him and help others going forward, and stop this cycle of, you know denial and perpetuating the disease of addiction. So it's important. It sounds weird, right? That's not something we should ever have to accept or understand, but it did make a difference.
I agree. I do think our culture is different than a lot of other cultures around the world if you've ever traveled.
Exactly.
And we're sort of a newer culture. I mean, we've only been at this for a couple hundred years, and we, in some ways, are immature, I think, as a culture. In the mainstream, we don't really talk about death very often. We're kind of a death denial, and we want to, like, okay, funeral by, okay, like we don't, like, other cultures sit with the dead body. They think about these things. They have, more traditional cultures, I would say, and it's a part of life. Death is a part of life, right? And having that in mind philosophically, I think can sometimes help people make decisions. But like you said, like facing that stark reality brought you to a different place where you were able to change the way you responded to him, and
Yeah.
the way, what decisions, how you were going to help, and how much, and what, and how that was going to look. And so, that being said, I want to read. I know this is silly, but the way you dedicated this book was amazing. Um, that I'm silly that I'm only reading the. I'm only going to quote your dedication right now, but this book is dedicated to those who, like the lotus flower, overcome the darkness and suffering, persevere through unimaginable pain, and rise with new hope every day. This book is dedicated to my husband Alex and my son Tyler, and to all the families who have lost their loved ones to this cruel enemy. And you say so much in just that little page. I was just like, whoa! I earmarked that page because all over the U.S., people are dying of overdoses and accidental alcohol deaths and fentanyl all the time. So people's kids are dying, and we've got I think, a pretty big crisis. Even though we have more help than ever in some ways, more information than ever, at least. Maybe not more hospitals or people that know how to help this stuff than ever. I'm not sure about that, but darkness and suffering, and have to have hope, and that is something that's hard to do, especially when your son or loved one is not okay. They're not okay. They're in a bad way. They might be in a relapse, and you have to be patient.
Yes.
So, what can you say? What any comments you want to say about that?
Well, um, I guess uh, the reason that this all came to be was because I was trying to help others recognize that if they were able to, I don't know how to say, I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, but um, turn that all that pain that they're experiencing from their family, their loved one suffering into some sort of purpose, some sort of meaning, some value, then it all will not only help themselves and help their loved one, but help many, many others. And we can all collectively, which is my desire, collectively lift one another. We can't, we're so, when you have a loved one with addiction, whether it's your spouse or your child or your parent, you are all consumed with their life and their survival. But if you can step away, back from that and try and focus on not just them, but yourself and others, I think the outcome for everyone is dramatically improved. And what I mean by that is when my son had long bouts of sobriety, I made the decision that I have to go back in and help those with crisis intervention training because of what happened to my son, with de-escalation tactics, so I did talks with law enforcement and medical, and I went in to work with a heroin addiction program with incarcerated individuals because I said, if I can help them, guess what that does? That helps me. It helps potentially my son because I learned so much more, and it helps globally. So it's this whole effort. And so again, I try to encourage others to find hope by helping more than just what's right in front of your eyes, and build from that and doing it earlier on. That's the whole message, is don't wait 10 or 15 or 20 years like I did. Get started early and find ways that you can make a difference for as many people as possible, and you'll see that how that benefit helps you and helps your loved one. You'll see how that blossoms in that way. But it's incredibly hard to do, right? When you're consumed with what's going on in front of you, it's hard to imagine, how can I go help somebody else when I can't even keep what's under my own roof straight. It's just a one of those things. When you feel like you are able, do it, because it will evolve your situation into a better one. It really will. That's all I can say, is it will.
Yes, I agree with you. Somebody I know who now runs the Parents of Addicted Loved Ones group. He's the president now. Both of his kids recovered from heavy, heavy drug use, and he was a police chief at the time. And so you're thinking, oh, a police officer who's the chief, he must know how to keep his kids under control and making sure they're not off there doing meth and heroin. No, not true. It happens everywhere and anywhere. And obviously, we know that people who are in poverty have a higher propensity of being thrown into addiction due to numerous factors, right? But but addiction, that may be true statistically, but addiction doesn't discriminate. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in the suburbs. It's happening in the cities. It's happening in the countryside. It's happening everywhere. So that being said, I do think, and you talk about this in your chapter, the criminalization of mental health, in which I want to dive into here.
Yeah.
I think that the systems, most mental health hospitals, I'm going to throw them under the bus right now. Most mental health hospitals, right there, most hospitals and a lot of police departments are about 40 to 50 years behind in their understanding of mental health. It's
Yes,
shocking to me.
it
Now,
is.
I mean, even just 20 years ago, outpatient counseling was years behind on mental health treatment. And because of all the new research with the adverse child experiences and the etiology of mental illnesses, and of course, the cross pollination with different, environmental factors, genetic factors, even what you eat can contribute to these things. Family of origin, exposure to different things, all these different factors, personality, that can lead to different. And we now know that there's a giant overlap of so many factors that can lead to mental health issues. And if you have mental health issues, as you say in your book or your chapter, A Well-Worn Path, you talk about that you're more likely to have if you have a mood disorder, you're more likely to eventually develop an addiction.
Yes.
So the hard part is, I'm just saying, I think as a country, we have to invest a lot of money that we're not investing right now into improving practices at mental health hospitals, improving triage at hospitals, and improving triage amongst the police departments. Now, I know a few cities have been doing this thing where they send social workers out on calls that they believe are more mental health related. That's literally within the last 3 years that's occurred, from what I understand. I mean, if you're a police officer, how are you supposed to do traffic stops, drug busts, come to a murder scene, and then help somebody who's mentally ill? I mean, it can all look like a threat to you, right? And so I don't know why we don't have some other department to handle that. We have a crisis line. That's cool now. That's good, but that's not enough. And I think police officers aren't educated on that. And also, should they have to be? I mean, there should be a whole division of the police that do only mental health, right? Because that's what we're in. We're in a mental health crisis and we're in a drug crisis. So
Right.
what are your thoughts on your experiences? I mean, I read the experience, which I'm not trying to spoil the book. People need to read this book, but it was gruesome what happened to him in jail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. Gosh, you gave me so many things to talk about there.
Oh, anything you want, go for it.
Well, no, and this is what I've been doing for the last couple of years because
Oh,
I'm
good.
passionate about working with law enforcement and making these outcomes better for both for them and for the individuals that they're serving. My mom was a liquor and narcotics agent as well, so I have law enforcement in my family. It's another reason for the purposes of the book. I have this trifecta of law enforcement back. My mom, just growing up in a law enforcement home, and that they're called liquor and narcotics agents in the state that I grew up. And then I'm in medicine, and then my son has, substance use disorder. So I kind of really started developing it from, all those angles. So that's what helped me go in and say, okay, what happened to my son was not right. Nothing about that evening should have happened. Putting it very, very simplistically, he was suicidal in the worst imaginable way, and ultimately he was put into solitary confinement in a suicidal state. And there's a lot of other information in there that's in the book, but that should never have happened. And I remember the chief of police telling me that this is where we have to house him. That was his exact words. This is where we have to house these people. And so as a result of that, that is when I started saying, okay, there's something wrong. There's a systemic problem within the police department about managing these situations. So that is why I went in and started doing mental health crisis intervention training for, they started to implement these crisis intervention mandatory training sessions for police officers. So that is one thing that they had been doing. The other thing was also what you're talking about that's been really sweeping across the country, called LEAD, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. And it is where they are allowing, getting other treatment options or things in place so that we don't go from addiction or mental health to jail, because we know that punishment does not equate to positive outcomes. Punishment is going to worsen the situation in the vast majority of cases. In addition, I just went to a pre-arrest diversion conference here in my state of North Carolina, and they are really trying to implement very systematically and methodically how to implement true plans, putting plans in place, how to pay for them, how to initiate them, how to educate people about them, to, instead of, you pick up a person with mental health or substance use disorder, and you can get them into the right resources at the right time in the right manner, as opposed to putting them in jail and letting them kind of sit there and rot in many, many cases, right? So This is happening. It is happening. And it's all, again, because what we were saying before, we're all having these conversations. We're all talking. People are getting together. They care. They're invested in it. They don't want to see these things happening to individuals anymore. And it's working a little bit. We're getting there. I say we're probably another decade or two away from really beneficial changes, but things are changing. And I also believe in the hospitals, if there was a better detox protocol, a better plan of action in terms of, like, we have standard of care when we're treating patients, right? So what is that standard of care for an individual that comes in with substance use disorder? Because I'll tell you right now, most individuals go into the emergency department, they get hydrated, and they get thrown back on the street. And there is nothing about that is going to have a good outcome. Nothing. Matter of fact, sometimes they're back in the hospital that same day, the next day, the same day, that same week, whether it's a heroin overdose or, an alcohol overdose, whatever it is. And so these are not effective measures. You can't hydrate somebody, put them back out there, because they're going to end up back in there. So there has to be a better plan. And we are recognizing the mental health crisis, the urgency of this. The National Institute of Health is recognizing it. The state levels recognizing it. And there just happens to be a good bit of money in my state right now coming in from federal money from the recent opioid.
Oh, the opioid crisis bill. I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah,
but it was one of the health bills. There was some money for opioid crisis. Yeah.
Correct. We are getting $1.8 billion infused into the state of North Carolina, and they are strictly putting that towards mental health and substance use disorder only. So even where I'm located in a very rural community, so it makes it even harder for individuals over in my area to get any kind of help. It's terrible, but they're actually building about, I think, 150 bed facility finally. In this small area. It's not small. It's actually a huge geographic, area, but it's everybody's so widespread. They just don't have access to care. And so we don't have detox facilities readily available. We don't have you don't have recovery facilities really here. And I'm talking, hundreds of miles of rural communities. So it's hundreds of thousands of people, but widespread, right? So these are the things that are going to benefit from the injection of these changes, I think. But again, we're a decade out.
Yeah. Yeah, we would have to. There's a lot of systems that need to overlap with mental health and medicine, and in a way that is bringing in the newer science of addiction and the newer science of why people use drugs and alcohol, and getting rid of that mentality that I think was even perpetuated in movies and TVs, that like people on drugs are crazy criminals, like these bad guy versus good guy type archetype. It's no, this is a suffering person. And how do we safely stop them from harming themselves and others while also offering legitimate treatment instead of punishment? I was in a training once, and somebody said if punishment worked, there wouldn't be any addicts or alcoholics in the world, because that's usually the first thing people do is try to punish them, either emotionally or physically, or the system. The criminal justice system is handling addiction, which is not what they're trained for. So, yeah.
Correct. But I will say that there's still some of those attitudes that are very strong. I still see it. I worked in the emergency room for a short time. There's still some really, really poor attitudes. These people are trash. These people, we need to get them out of here. I'm not going to deal. My son, he dealt with somebody who was a mental health deputy. So he had been, supposedly, he got an extra 20 hours of training to be a mental health deputy. So you get paid more. He was not a nice individual who cared very much about the circumstances. He didn't de-escalate the situation, so I don't know if he had any additional de-escalation training. I don't know if he had any mental health training. It's important to understand mental health. There's, addiction is not in a vacuum. There is underlying issues all the time. So it's really important to understand sort of the whole picture. But I just think we have failed individuals miserably, and my son happened to be one of those individuals that was horrifically failed.
Yes, the systems. Yeah, we could keep going on the systems. I think the hard part is if you're a person who feels powerless right now, you can get involved. If it's your relative, obviously there's a lot to get involved in there. But if it's just you're a concerned citizen, it's important that when we look at funding for public health, that includes public safety, that new paradigms are incorporated. I think leads, like you talked about with the people going on, some of these calls, is just the tip of the iceberg of what we need.
It is.
The funding for ad addiction, I think, needs to be upgraded with who knows what. I'm not a politician, but more tax on drugs and alcohol.
Please, yes.
More taxes on opiates, which are sometimes necessary but overprescribed, and that needs to be paying for, especially a lot of people who can't afford treatment. Like you were able to use your private insurance and your money to pay for your son's treatment, but how many people
Yes.
haven't? The only option they have is a Medicaid hospital, which is underfunded, falling apart, and has no mental health wing. Right? How many? That's most of America, unless you live near a big city where you might get lucky to get your Medicaid accepted in a more advanced hospital, maybe depending on the city and depending on the state. Right? So I think this is a societal issue. Like people say, addiction's a family issue. That's true, but it's also because there's emotional components and there's dynamics. But it's a societal issue. And it's a personal issue. It's all of the above, and they all intersect. And I think as a person who's a concerned citizen, you can advocate in your community for more funding for mental health that actually does things, right? Into the schools, right? Prevention, into the police departments, into, are there hospitals and facilities that accept people for addiction treatment? And how do we treat people with addiction? Are we just labeling them as felonious criminals? I mean, obviously, drug dealers obviously have a different penalty when they get caught. But why are people who are using heroin get thrown in jail and get charged? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense to me. So you can make change by speaking up, but to speak up, you got to get educated. I mean, that's why you wrote this book. I'm assuming is to get people educated.
Absolutely. But I want to emphasize too, because I always want to say this. This is not across the board with all police. Like they're
No.
all doing that. Matter of fact, one of the biggest endorsements I have on the back of my book is from a chief of police in Ohio who really advocates for individuals on the street that are, going through this as well. And he wants, very much just like all of us, want that change to occur. And he's making major things happen for that to happen. So I recognize, and I have worked with some incredible individuals in law enforcement that just really want, and in medicine, that care so much for individuals with these, issues and want to make a difference. So that's what I want to encourage, is more of those people to sort of shun and the other people that are not so kind and not so helpful and not so empathetic and have really become apathetic in their professions, to have some self-examination about that. And when I did my talks, that is something that I worked on. I say this all the time, I had the hardcore narcotics agents come up to me after my talk and tears in their eyes and saying, I really need to do some serious self-examination. I'm not doing things as well as I used to, not treating people like I should. And that's all I wanted. That's what I was there for.
And, and to be fair, it's a hard job. And so I think the hard part is, how do we make not only changes with the education, but how do we actually bring mental health help into hospitals and public safety so that they get support and they're not burned out? And that is tough.
Absolutely. My gosh, that's when I went in, I talk about compassion fatigue and professional burnout, and then their own mental health. Because there's high suicide rates for officers and things like that. I talk about all that with them and say how important it is for them to have their own check. There's a great quote, and I don't have it right in front of me, so I'll probably completely screw it up, but it's ultimately saying that, it's impossible to be confronted with, all the trauma and the daily stressors and things that officers and medical personnel see, like paramedics, what they see every day. It's impossible to not be affected by that. And if you think you can, it's like walking through water and expecting not to get wet. It is so true. Like you have to be able to recognize that taking on the burden of taking care of people in society and these, everyday traumas and everyday um, deaths and, motor vehicle accidents and gunshot wounds and things like that. We're seeing some of those individuals are seeing the worst of the worst. They're going to be affected by that. So how do they manage that? How do we deal with that?
I agree. I think these are conversations we have to have as a society because the status quo is not working.
Right.
We've evolved. We are now. I don't know if it ever was working, but culturally,
There you
we
go.
are we are seeing the effects, and this is like so. I says cultural because like it starts with us to get the awareness up, but then how do we support economically those who are doing that and getting them the training, getting them the support, and then that will make a difference because people who don't have a mom and a dad like he had, like your son has, they don't have those parents to help them and go through all this with them, or they don't have a sibling. They are dependent on the system. They're dependent on the criminal justice system and they're dependent on the hospital system and that's not enough, right? And so then that
No, it's
it's a
not
tough
enough.
it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing. So um I like that your book has not only your personal discussion but a lot of nuance because this is a nuanced thing. There is not a fix all, right? There's a lot of things you talk about in the book in the ending about, you know, different medical treatments, non-medical treatments, counseling, sober living, treatment facilities, and you kind of explain these to people in a way that's very relatable. I also like that you talked about all these really. Oh, you have PAL group. I didn't see that. You do have the PAL group listed in here as one of the groups that you can go to. Group therapy, state specific, books.
The,
Important to get information when you're in these situations.
the reason I did that was because the reason I put all that in there was because even again, as a medical professional, I didn't really understand all the language. It's decoding that language of addiction, understanding what like if you're not working in this environment, if you haven't been exposed to addiction or mental health or medicine and you are coming to this completely blind, it's like going to a different country and trying to learn that language. And so I was trying to put it the way I would talk to my patients for the most part, not making it too technical, but also keeping it, relevant. And there's things like I put in there transcranial magnetic stimulation. How would people know about that if they're not, eh, you know, if they're not being told about it, right? If they're not
Mhm.
investigating it, and how do they even know if it's available? How do they know what it is? What does that even mean? I talk about things like I say pink cloud. Somebody on the outside might not understand what that is. I never knew what that was till over 10 years of going through this with my son. So I just try to give a lot of vocabulary and explanation of things so that it's a little easier to navigate this system. So you're not just kind of going through sludge for years and years and trying to figure it out with yes, there are a ton of resources, but how do you go through, how do you, I don't know, figure those resources out, which direction to go, and how do you decode what they're even talking about in some cases. So that's where I was coming from.
I think that's great, and the book is short and readable. So I think that anybody can read this book, and I think knowledge is power. I believe knowledge is power, and I think that is one of the hardest things for people to undertake. Is like, wow, I have to learn about this stuff, and that can be an issue as well. So, um, your son is still in your life. You and him have a different relationship now. So like you said, it's not like a fairy tale, because when you're dealing with addiction, there's always a chance of relapses. I always say relapse is part of recovery, right? We learn again why we're not trying to use. But
Yeah.
it's a rough road. So anything you wanted to say about that, how things are with you now that you've written the book and things like that?
My son is so supportive of this. I was so scared that I asked him every step of the way about his, involvement. And he 100% was like, I want this to be out there to help others. I think it's one of the most courageous things he's ever done. We still are very, very close and talk pretty much every single day. He doesn't live in the same state I do. And that's awful. I wish he did, but we're very close, and he still struggles. This is not a fairy tale. This isn't something that it's a perfect ending no matter what, but he is working on himself, and that's all any of us can do. So I'm just grateful for that, and grateful for this opportunity to help others in the process. It's hard. Some days I'm like, I don't want to help anybody else. I just want to stay under my covers and avoid, but it's important to do it. And ultimately, it helps me survive. It helps my son survive. It helps us all get through this, so it's a part of the process.
Good. I'm glad you mentioned that. And, kind of in conclusion, I mean, it is a process. For anyone who's, like you said, most people in the US are affected, like 47% are affected by somebody who's got an addiction. It's a process. If you dive in, though, it's going to be much better than if you don't take the risk to dive in and learn the information. So it doesn't make things easy. It can make things easier. It doesn't mean your life will get easier, but you will be better equipped to deal with whatever life is giving you. So
Absolutely. Can't agree with you more. That's why we did it.
And I'm going to put this in the show notes, just for people that don't like to click in the show notes. Where can they buy your book, Incurable Hope by Lisa Gennosa? Where can they buy this?
Anywhere books are sold, anywhere, any bookstore, of course on Amazon, any Barnes and Noble, any bookstore, any even private. If you have an indie bookstore, independent, they can order it through Ingram Spark. I also have it on Audible and ebook, of course, and so it's there, and you can also click on it from my website. I don't know if that'll be on your listing, but it's just my name, lisagenosa.com with 2 N's.
It'll be in there for sure. So we'll definitely have that available for everyone. And I really want to thank you for your time and telling your story. Very brave.
Thank you so much for having me, and I just hope others will take something from this and help them out as well. And I just appreciate all the time.
And there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician podcast. If you're enjoying this show, please share it with people you know. I would surely appreciate it. Or take just a minute to give us a rating on iTunes. As most of you know, I am passionate about preventing future violence in the United States. My colleagues and I have started a nonprofit called the National Violence Prevention Hotline, a 501c3 organization. We are endeavoring to gain funding and collaborators so that we can start a 24/7 hotline and chat line to reach potential perpetrators before they act violently. It is a bold effort to save lives and curb violence by working to connect with potential offenders while they are in the planning stages of violence, help to de-escalate them, and provide resources so that they can get appropriate professional help. The National Violence Prevention Hotline is looking to open up a conversation about violence in society, the causes, and the solutions. You can learn more by visiting our website, www.violencepreventionhotline.org. Join us online by signing our petition on the website, sharing the website with your network of people, donating to the cause if you like, and you can now even write your congressperson from our website with a simple form. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If you are a therapist looking for ethical and excellent medical billing services, check out therapistbillingservicesllc.com. That's www.therapistbillingservicesllc.com. Billing services created by therapists for therapists. If you're looking for an EMDR International Association consultant, I am a consultant and I can provide you the 20 hours you need to become EMDRIA certified. I have groups online and in person, and I do individual consultation. Just send me a message at the website and I'll get back to you. If you want to get trained in EMDR therapy, check out the great training opportunities with EMDR Training Solutions. I've worked with them before and they are phenomenal, so register today. If you are in need of counseling, do not hesitate to make an appointment at a local counseling center in your area. You can also make an appointment with the excellent clinicians in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area at Health for Life Counseling and the Trauma Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids by visiting www.healthforlifegr.com. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss and his guest, and while these are based on the literature they have read and the experience in their fields, this should not be viewed as a definitive opinion on any subject. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you're in a crisis, please dial 911 or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988. You can also text 741-741 and a live trained crisis counselor will respond. Did you know you could support your local bookstore by shopping at www.bookshop.org? You can order from the comfort of your own home online while supporting local brick and mortar businesses near you. If you are a therapist and you are not a member of your national or local therapy organizations such as the American Counseling Association or the American Mental Health Counselors Association, please get involved. At least pay the dues. It will help the lobbyists in our field keep us from becoming gig workers. And of course, there's the bonus of increasing mental health education around the United States and helping people understand what counseling is and promoting best practices within our profession. Until next time, I wish you all a safe and peaceful week.